In the winter of 1887, authorities discovered 43 emaciated bodies crammed into the coal-burning furnace room of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia. They had been locked inside for 3 days without food, water, or heat, left to freeze to death by the very man hired to care for them. This is the story of America's most inhuman caretaker and the asylum that became a tomb. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum opened its doors in 1864, promising revolutionary treatment for the mentally ill. Built from native sandstone quarried on the grounds, its Gothic Revival architecture stretched across 666 acres of rolling West Virginia hills. The building itself was a marvel, 4 stories high, with corridors that seemed to stretch into eternity, and rooms designed to house 250 patients in comfort and dignity. But by 1887, nearly 2,600 souls were crammed within its walls. Dr. Samuel Kirkbride had envisioned moral treatment, fresh air, productive work, and compassionate care. What evolved instead was a warehouse for society's unwanted: violent criminals declared insane to avoid execution, epileptics abandoned by their families, women committed for hysteria after questioning their husband's authority, children as young as 8 labeled feeble-minded for the crime of poverty. Into this chaos stepped James Duncan, a man whose name would become synonymous with institutional cruelty. Duncan arrived at Trans-Allegheny in 1885, hired as head attendant during one of the asylum's darkest periods. At 34, he possessed the physical strength needed to subdue violent patients, and the cold demeanor administrators mistook for professional detachment. His references spoke of military discipline and unwavering authority. What they failed to mention was his growing obsession with absolute control. The asylum's overcrowding had created impossible conditions. Patients slept 3 to a bed designed for 1. The air reeked of human waste, carbolic acid, and despair. Staff were overwhelmed, underpaid, and increasingly brutal in their methods. Into this hellscape, Duncan introduced his own twisted philosophy of care. He believed the mentally ill were subhuman, creatures to be contained rather than cured. In his personal journal, discovered decades later, Duncan wrote, "These wretches understand only pain and fear. Kindness is wasted on minds already lost to God's grace." Duncan's methods began subtly. Patients who spoke out of turn found their meals withheld. Those who resisted bath time were subjected to ice-cold water treatments that lasted hours. But as his authority grew unchallenged, so did his cruelty. The furnace room became his preferred punishment chamber. Located in the asylum's basement, the furnace room was designed to house the massive coal-burning boilers that heated the building. During winter months, temperatures inside reached over 100 degrees. The air was thick with coal dust and smoke. It was never intended for human habitation. Duncan discovered that patients feared the furnace room above all else. The intense heat, the deafening roar of the boilers, the choking atmosphere. It was torture without leaving visible marks. He began using brief stays in the furnace room as punishment for minor infractions: 5 minutes for talking during meals, 10 minutes for refusing medication. But Duncan's sadism knew no bounds. Patient Margaret Finnegan, admitted for postpartum depression after the loss of her infant son, became one of Duncan's earliest victims. Her crime was asking when she might see her family again. Duncan dragged her to the furnace room and locked her inside for an entire night. When attendants found her the next morning, she was catatonic. Her hair singed, her clothing soaked with sweat, and worse. Margaret never spoke again. The asylum's official records, maintained by Duncan himself, show no mention of furnace room punishments. But patients whispered of the screams that echoed through the ventilation system. They spoke of friends who disappeared for days, only to return broken and silent. Some never returned at all. Dr. William Morrison, the asylum's chief physician, was either willfully ignorant or complicit in Duncan's reign of terror. Morrison rarely ventured beyond his comfortable office on the first floor, content to sign death certificates and collect his salary. When concerned family members inquired about missing relatives, Morrison assured them their loved ones were receiving the finest care modern medicine could provide. The winter of 1887 brought unusually harsh weather to West Virginia. Temperatures plummeted below freezing for weeks. The asylum's antiquated heating system struggled to warm the massive building. Coal supplies ran dangerously low. It was during this bitter cold snap that Duncan committed his most heinous act. On February 14, 1887, Valentine's Day, a minor riot erupted in the asylum's dining hall. Patients, driven to desperation by spoiled food and frozen sleeping quarters, began throwing plates and overturning tables. The uprising lasted less than 10 minutes before attendants restored order. Duncan's response was swift and merciless. He identified 43 patients as ringleaders. Men, women, and children, ranging in age from 12 to 74. Their alleged crimes included throwing food, shouting obscenities, and failing to immediately comply with orders to return to their rooms. That evening, under cover of darkness, Duncan and 4 attendants herded the 43 patients into the furnace room. The coal fires had been extinguished hours earlier due to fuel shortages. The massive room, which had been hellishly hot during the day, was now becoming a frozen tomb. Duncan turned the key in the heavy iron door and walked away. For 3 days, those 43 souls remained locked in the furnace room, without food, water, heat, or sanitation. The temperature inside dropped below freezing. Patients huddled together for warmth, but hypothermia claimed the weakest first. The elderly died within hours. Children lasted slightly longer, their small bodies generating what little heat they could. By the second day, the strongest among them were pounding on the door, their fists bloodied from striking iron. Their screams for help echoed through the asylum's basement corridors, but Duncan had forbidden any staff from entering the lower levels. On the third day, silence fell over the furnace room. When Duncan finally opened the door on February 17, 1987, he found a scene that would haunt even his twisted conscience. Bodies were frozen together in grotesque embraces. Children clutched dead adults who had tried to shield them from the cold. The walls were stained with blood from desperate attempts to claw through stone and mortar. 43 human beings had died in agony, victims of one man's sadistic interpretation of care. Duncan's initial plan was to dispose of the bodies in the asylum's private cemetery, listing their deaths as natural causes: heart failure, pneumonia, complications from their mental conditions. It was a plan that might have succeeded if not for a single witness. Thomas Hartwell was a maintenance worker who had served the asylum faithfully for over a decade. Unlike the medical staff, who rarely ventured into the darker corners of the building, Hartwell knew every inch of Trans-Allegheny. He had heard the screams from the furnace room. He had seen Duncan's smug satisfaction when the building fell silent. On the morning of February 18th, Hartwell made a decision that would expose Duncan's crimes. He contacted the local sheriff and the state health inspector, providing detailed accounts of what he had witnessed. What do you think drove Duncan to such extremes? Was it the brutal conditions of asylum work, or something darker within the man himself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The investigation that followed shocked even hardened yawmen. Sheriff Robert McKinley, a Civil War veteran who had seen the worst of human brutality, reportedly vomited when he first entered the furnace room. The state health inspector, Dr. Charles Whitman, described the scene as, quote, beyond the bounds of civilized behavior, unquote, a crime against humanity itself. Duncan's journal, seized as evidence, revealed the full extent of his depravity. Page after page detailed his punishments, his methods, his growing contempt for the patients in his care. One entry, dated just days before the massacre, read, "These creatures multiply their suffering through their very existence. Perhaps it would be merciful to end their misery permanently." But the most damning evidence came from the asylum's own records. Duncan had meticulously documented every patient under his care, including detailed notes about their fears and weaknesses. He had studied them not to provide better treatment, but to devise more effective torture. The trial of James Duncan began in September 1887, drawing national attention to the horrors of America's asylum system. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the Furnace Room Massacre and the Monster of Trans-Allegheny. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Foster, presented a case so overwhelming that Duncan's defense attorney reportedly begged him to plead guilty and throw himself on the court's mercy. Duncan refused. Even facing overwhelming evidence, he maintained that his actions were justified, that the patients were dangerous animals who needed to be controlled through fear and pain. In his final statement to the court, Duncan showed no remorse, declaring, quote, "I did what was necessary to maintain order in a house of madness," unquote. "History will vindicate my methods." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. James Duncan was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that seemed insufficient given the magnitude of his crimes. But before justice could be served, Duncan cheated the gallows in the most cowardly way possible. On the night before his scheduled execution, Duncan was found dead in his cell, having fashioned a noose from his bed sheets. His final act was one of self-preservation, denying his victims' families the satisfaction of seeing justice done.
But Duncan's death did not end the horror of Trans-Allegheny. The asylum continued operating for another century, accumulating a reputation as one of America's most haunted locations. Staff and visitors reported hearing screams from the furnace room, even though it had been permanently sealed after Duncan's crimes. Some claimed to see the ghostly figures of children wandering the basement corridors, forever searching for warmth and comfort they never found in life. The building's official records show that over 2,400 patients died within its walls during its 130-year operation. Many were buried in unmarked graves on the asylum grounds, their names forgotten, their stories lost to time. But the 43 victims of the Furnace Room Massacre were different. Their deaths sparked nationwide reforms in mental health care, leading to improved oversight of asylums and the gradual implementation of more humane treatment methods. Their suffering, though unimaginable, helped prevent countless others from enduring similar fates. Dr. Morrison, the chief physician who had turned a blind eye to Duncan's crimes, faced his own reckoning. Though not criminally charged, he was stripped of his medical license and spent his remaining years in obscurity, purportedly haunted by guilt over his failure to protect his patients. The asylum itself closed in 1994, its Gothic towers standing empty against the West Virginia sky. Today, it operates as a tourist attraction, offering ghost tours and historical exhibits. Visitors can walk the same corridors where Duncan once prowled, can stand in the dining hall where the fatal riot began, but they cannot enter the furnace room. It remains sealed, a tomb within a tomb, holding secrets too terrible to disturb. The story of James Duncan and the Trans-Allegheny Furnace Room Massacre forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. Duncan was not an anomaly. He was the product of a system that dehumanized the mentally ill, that warehoused them in overcrowded institutions with minimal oversight. Even today, as we pride ourselves on advances in mental health care, we must ask, how many James Duncans walk among us? How many vulnerable souls suffer in silence behind institutional walls? How many crimes against humanity remain hidden because society chooses not to look? The screams that once echoed from Trans-Allegheny's furnace room serve as a permanent reminder that the capacity for both cruelty and compassion exists within us all. The question is not whether monsters like Duncan exist, it's whether we have the courage to confront them when they do. In the basement of that Gothic asylum, 43 souls perished in the cold and darkness, victims of one man's twisted interpretation of care. Their names are carved on a memorial plaque installed in 2001, a small gesture of remembrance for lives that were forgotten for over a century. Margaret Finnegan, Thomas Crawford, Sarah Mills, 40 others whose stories we may never fully know. They died alone, afraid and abandoned by a society that should have protected them. But their memory lives on as a warning, a reminder that the price of ignoring suffering is measured not just in individual tragedy, but in the erosion of our collective humanity. The furnace room of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands sealed to this day, a monument to mankind's capacity for both unspeakable cruelty and the redemption that comes from facing our darkest truths. Their screams may have finally fallen silent, but their story must never be forgotten. If this investigation into America's darkest medical history has opened your eyes to the horrors that once lurked behind asylum walls, there are countless more untold stories waiting in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue uncovering the medical mysteries and institutional nightmares that history tried to bury. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones society wanted to forget.